We've had 5 games in the World Chess Championship of 2021 and viewers have been complaining that this is just boring chess because players are playing like machines. They are not taking any risks and we are getting no results. But what we have witnessed today was absolutely incredible. Oh boy, what a game this was. Let's jump straight into it. This is game number 6. All 5 games before this have been draws. Magnus Carlsen is playing with the white pieces and Ian Nepomniachtchi is playing as black. Magnus started with the queen's pawn opening and then he goes for a very unusual and rare pseudo-Catalan variation. Now guys, this is a very long game. It is the longest game ever played in the World Championship history, so I'll be going a little fast, but we'll analyze all the critical positions. So we have a few exchanges along the way, and after a few more trades we are on move number 25 and Ian plays rook to c8. He's offering both his rooks for the queen. Magnus decides to go for it, and here's where the game becomes interesting. We have a huge imbalance in the position. Now this is a classical game and the players get 120 minutes to make their first 40 moves. As of move number 27, both players are battling against time. Magnus has 18 minutes whereas Nepo is left with 32 minutes to make their next 13 moves each. It might seem a lot of time, but it isn't. Anyway, we have b4, a4 and all these pawns are now locked. Ian will probably now look to attack these pawns with his dark squared bishop, but let's see how it goes. Magnus goes after the bishop and here Nepo has a few good options along this diagonal. The safest bet would be bishop to e5, but there is also this tricky line where he can play bishop b2 and sacrifice his bishop. If white takes with the knight, then he loses his rook, and if he takes with the rook, then he loses his knight and these pawns are also in trouble. Plus there could also be some nasty checks with some double attacks on the rook and king, but it is not that clear how to proceed. Therefore Nepo went for the safe option, pulling back his bishop to e5. Magnus goes h4, making some room for the king. Nepo goes h5, preventing any further pawn attacks on the king side. King moves to the corner, ruling out the possibility of any nasty checks from black. Magnus is left with only 3 minutes and he has 9 more moves to make. It is Nepo's turn and he thinks for almost 10 minutes and ends up playing bishop b2, the idea that I showed you earlier. As per the engines, there are many crazy lines for Magnus, and if he plays this perfectly then he could end up with an advantage. But he has only 3 minutes left, so he instantly plays rook to c5. Queen moves, and now it might seem quite obvious to pick up these pawns with the rook. But if the rook leaves the c file, black could possibly push e5, e4 and create some complications. Going back, in this position a good option for white could be to move this rook to the second rank so that they defend each other and also create some tactics to trap this bishop. But Magnus doesn't play that and he goes for rook d1. Now white can take with the knight because it will support the rook. Therefore black takes, white takes, queen d7 attacks the rook, rook c5 leaves this pawn undefended. This knight is pinned, so everyone's waiting in anticipation for Nepo to take the free pawn. But no, he goes for a different plan, e5. It seems he's probably trying to bluff Magnus with unusual moves to eat up his time, and to an extent he succeeds in that. Magnus thinks for more than a minute and ends up with rook c2. Nepo again refuses to pick up the pawn and plays queen d5. The engine in the meanwhile is going crazy. This is such a complicated position that it's difficult to tell who is actually winning. And what adds to the fun is that both players are under serious time pressure. 1 minute left for Magnus and 2 minutes for Nepo to make the next 4 moves. Magnus doubles his rooks, queen jumps to b3, both players are in blitz mode, rook a2, then e4 attacks the knight, knight to c5 attacks the queen, and finally Nepo picks up the pawn. Both players make their 40th move just in time and this gives them an additional 1 hour of play. Oof, this was a thrilling last few minutes. They made some mistakes, they missed opportunities, especially in the last few moves, but that's just time pressure. And honestly, that's what we all enjoy. And after all this madness, the engine says 0.0. The game is exactly equal. That's ridiculous. Okay, so after a short break, we see some solid moves as usual. Both players are simply maneuvering their pieces and eventually Magnus sees an opportunity. He invites Ian to pick up the rook for a bishop and a pawn. Ian declines the offer and instead he grabs this pawn on move number 53. Magnus can't take because of the pin. We advance ahead a few more moves The commentators are predicting a draw and waiting for things to get over. We cross move 60. The players get additional 15 minutes with a 30-second increment. Magnus is keeping all his pieces defended. It's all solid stuff as we expect at this level. Now on move 64, Ian pushes f5, making way for his king and also preventing any of these pawn pushes from white. Both players try out different things, and eventually on move 79, Nepo loses a pawn. The game again starts to get interesting. After queen d3, Nepo is threatening to take this pawn. We've reached a critical position, and here's where Magnus takes the initiative and comes up with an interesting idea. He goes rook f7 check, sacrificing the rook, and then rook b7 check, picking up the bishop. So basically he exchanges the rook for a pawn and a bishop. The fight is still on. It's rook, knight and two pawns versus the queen. It's highly unlikely for black to win it from here, but draw seems the most likely result. Anyway, the game crosses 100 moves, and again it seems we are heading towards a draw. Players are just moving around, gaining some time because of the 30-second increment, and we reach this position. On move number 110, Magnus finally pushes one of his pawns and we are out of the 50 move rule. Soon after that, we have a pawn exchange, and it still looks very difficult to progress. If white wants to win this, he will have to get everything, literally everything going up together. Remember, Magnus is an endgame genius, so if there's anyone who can do this, it's probably him. It's been more than 7 hours and the players are still fighting it out. We've passed 124 moves, and with that, this game becomes the longest ever game played in World Championship history. Magnus is slowly improving his pieces. His plan is to keep his king tucked on this side of the board behind all his pieces and advance towards the top. Nepo needs to be careful. He has to keep his queen on such squares from where he can control this diagonal and at the same time also give checks to the king on this side of the board. On move 130, he went queen e6, and here's where the tables start to turn in white's favor. Magnus gets into this very good position where his knight is covering the king and ready to attack this way. So Magnus moves ahead with e6. Black can't take the rook because of this fork. Queen g6, rook f7. The queen still cannot take because of this knight check, and even if he captures all these pieces, Magnus ends up winning in a pawn endgame. Therefore, in this position, king moves to the side. Magnus presses forward, and ultimately we have this beautiful position where everything is defending each other. The king will run away this way and a pawn promotion is just inevitable. Therefore, in this position, Ian Nepomniachtchi resigned. What a thrilling game, 8 hours of nerve-wracking chess and probably the most exciting game you will ever see at this level. Guys, if you also enjoyed this game, then hit that like button right now and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I shall see you in the next one.